couple of things. Well, welcome everyone, and we had many varied discussions with Ian over the months and on law matters and finance matters and metaphysical matters, and then he comes up with the idea he's going to do sacred geometry. What a surprise! So I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure you all are, and let's see how that links in with law and spirit and anything else that we want to put together with it. Okay,
Thanks
over
for
to
coming,
you.
everyone. This is an introduction, so we're just going to skim across the top. You can study this stuff for 30 or 40 years, as you would know in any other discipline, and still not understand it fully. So it's very, very deep, and what I want to do tonight, just for fun, just see who turns up, is just skim across the top of it. George has very kindly asked me to link the law into sacred geometry, and it might seem like they're so disparate you couldn't possibly do it, but the real link is that the law is an esoteric art. Right? That's what the law is, and being good at winning any matter or outcome is about, you have to have a very good understanding of the esoteric, and most people don't realise that the courts are founded upon esoteric principles, and it's referred to in the legal system as the realm. Have you heard that expression? And you'll see it in all the statutes, and in the you'll see the realm and temporal matters is another expression which refers to spiritual matters, which is the word that George likes to use, and most legally trained professionals don't understand it. And I'm talking about barristers and lawyers. And just as by way of background for you guys, I've been with no legal experience, two very senior people in the legal industry 5 times, using these methods. So now trying to link, and you know, obviously there's some intellectual stuff with their statutes and like rules of engagement, because we have rules, and that's a very lower level of reality when you're playing a legal game. The real game is something that's not easily seen. It has to be seen through awareness and understanding. So that's just for George, because he's made me link it. So I'm going to bring a few interesting things in. I'll be very curious to see whether anyone's aware of this, what I'm going to talk tonight. That little dot there, sitting on the screen, is sitting on supposedly a black background, which isn't showing up terrifically well tonight. But the idea of this is that in the beginning, as we've all heard, there was nothing. There was no thing. Right? So look at the word etymology. We just use that word very loosely, but there was no thing in the beginning. Has everyone heard that story? Okay. And out of that nothingness, or no thing, it's just a void, some sort of void. That's represented by a black background. And the void has no dimension. Right? So we have these two concepts of there being no thing, and then something happened, and in a biblical frame of reference, God said, "Let there be light."
Hang on.
Here we go. We've got some biblical stuff coming in here.
It's not the biblical stuff. There is nothing. That includes what you said is God. Where did God suddenly come from? There was nothing.
That's right.
And
so
then God said something? What are you talking about, this God? Where did that come from?
Well, we're going to get to that, but we're doing sacred geometry, so I'm using this as some context, so just bear with me, alright? Because it does mess with your head, doesn't it? That's the whole idea.
I like it to have consistency, so that jump from nothing to something hasn't been consistent so far. I have an understanding. There is something different.
Right, well, if
And
you can do the presentation,
and
if
it
you
is-
like.
It is the one.
We are talking about sacred geometry, okay?
Yep.
And the concept there is that something appeared out of no thing. Right? This is what sacred geometry is about. Now, I've used a biblical frame of reference just because that's the one that most people have heard, and that can be argued, right? We're not here to be right, we're here to listen, and you can make an assessment about what you're hearing.
Well, I'm assessing that somebody's observing the something that appeared.
Yeah,
So there's two. There's two in that.
this is a concept. that we're
Okay,
talking
something has appeared. There's an appearer, one that views, and the thing that is viewed. So there's two there. It's come from nothing.
Yeah, there's the void
From the void,
and there's light, right? In this example, which is a representation of something. So all this is just a representation, correct? Right, so the story is irrelevant. It is irrelevant. It's what sits under the story that we're trying to get in touch with, right? And that's, there was no thing, correct?
yes,
No
Yes.
thing, not just nothing, no
nothing,
thing.
nothing.
The thing is matter, right, in this context.
Existence,
Matter. And
existence.
we're talking about sacred geometry here. And we'll get to this in a minute, so just relax. and you can see how we go. So, Woody Allen said, God said, let there be light. And then he said, there was still nothing, but at least you could see a bit better.
Yes.
That was Woody Allen. So is this a bit weird for you? It's quite weird because we're talking about nothing, no thing. Now in sacred geometry, what we're trying to do with actual, in a two-dimensional plane, in this case, is we're trying to expand this concept of there being no thing and then something coming into existence. Right? You happy with that? We talked about a point of light in this example and a void. Now, that's a three-dimensional representation. Right? Can everyone see that? So we're talking about up, down, you know, sideways, and it's a three-dimensional representation. Now, what we're really trying to say here is that in this void, this concept of dimensional space in three dimensions was created. Right? It's just a concept. Right? The other thing you'll notice at the top of the slide there is that in sacred geometry, that straight lines we see as male energy. Right? Now this hopefully will become a little more apparent as we move forward. So what we've got there, to try and just get your head around this, if we have a piece of paper and we imagine that it actually has no thickness at all, but that we can, and we just draw a line on that, just say one line, how many dimensions does that have?
One.
Two.
Oh, I thought it was a straight line.
Yeah. Anyone disagree with that? Or? Right.
I could.
So we have a two-dimensional representation when we just have, say, one line drawn on a piece of paper that has no thickness at all. And so this is another imaginary concept. And then we're adding this other dimension, which gives us volume. Right? Now, volume is three-dimensional. Everyone agree with that? Yeah. What do you reckon, Paul?
Well, you see, when I said two,
Yeah.
I was about to give you the proper answer, which is I can't answer it because you haven't given me a viewpoint. Because you have somehow assumed that I'm looking at that sheet of paper
Yeah.
so that I'm seeing the two dimensions.
Yeah, it's what you see in your mind, isn't it? And that's what we're mucking around with. Right? So that represents three dimensions, and that's the world we're all sort of walking around in.
Attributed to Descartes, which is why they call it a Cartesian axis.
Yeah. So just to try and add to this concept of there being no thing and then this sort of three-dimensional space with volume, all we've done here is join every point on the previous slide, every point with a straight line. Okay? And so if you look at that, you have to imagine that it's actually a three-dimensional object. And that all comes from those three lines in those three different axes, right? And that produces that shape there, which is called an octahedron. So that's three-dimensional. Now, I'm just getting across the top of this, because now I'm going to bring in the feminine energy. That's called a vesica piscis. Has everyone seen that before?
Vector diagrams, what I call them.
Yeah. Well, it's used in set theory. Yeah. But that's a vesica piscis, and that's a very, 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 very important symbol, if you like, in sacred geometry. So, and that's feminine energy. Okay. So here's just a little digression. These are both very important as well. Now the one on the left, that shape has been created just by repeating the previous slide, adding circles to it uniformly, and we get that rather interesting geometric.
Also called flower.
Nelly, that's not quite the flower of life, but we're getting there. And if we take all the noise out of that, how we've constructed that, we get that, just the circles on the right, right? That's, you can see the outline of those circles on the right. So I just want to show you something really interesting, and that's this, right? Now, the egg of life is called such. It has the same number of circles as our previous geometric representations, and every organism, living organism, where an egg is fertilised, looks like that without exception. Right? And it's based on what I'm arguing here, which we're going to see a bit more evidence of. It's based on sacred geometry. Right? So that's the egg of life on the right there. So that's the sort of actual representation of what we just looked at from something we constructed with some circles. That's the flower of life that you were representing, talking about. Now we're just skimming across the top here because this is very, very deep stuff, which requires a lot of contemplation. But that's simply being constructed by adding more circles, which are the feminine energy, and we end up with that shape there, all just made out of drawing circles through each of their centre points and adding circles and adding circles. Now, just some points of interest in relation to that. These are on the temple of Seti, which is in Egypt on the Giza Plateau, and you can see that they're etched into a pillar. We don't know how they were etched into the pillars of that temple in Egypt, but what we do know is, and the reason I put this slide in, is that this knowledge has been hidden for a very long time. Some of the things that we're going to look at in a bit more depth, and it goes even further back than Egypt. That's India, and that's just another example. With the flower of life again on the floor of a temple in India. They're just everywhere. Just some nature now. I'm just going to quickly flick through this. Does everyone agree that there's some sort of uniform pattern and shape in that plant? I can show you the sacred geometry. It's a uniform shape, isn't it? Hey?
A spiral?
Yeah. It's something with a bit of volume. I'm just going to flick through these. Right. I can show you all the sacred geometry in each of these pictures and how this is actually how matter, any matter, has actually come from these concepts of sacred geometry. They're just plants in nature. Very beautiful, aren't they?
Beautiful.
Yeah. Pine cone. Very uniform. Okay, it's an interesting one I've just thrown in. It's a cross section of DNA on the right. You can see a sort of a geometric looking pattern there. Now if we had a 3D representation of the DNA on the right, it's also spiralling, and I don't want to get into the vortex and magnetic fields we touched on the other day. Just looking at some representations at the moment. Now I've jumped a little bit into an area called cymatics, and I'm sure you guys have seen something called cymatics. Have you ever seen some sand on a steel plate? You just put some frequencies through it and you see these patterns just materialise. Oh, well, this is a slightly different domain, but that image on the left is produced purely through sound, right? Frequency, transmitted into some water. Right?
Would that be similar to what they do with the water when they actually have put energy into the water and they freeze differently?
That's Emoto's work, and I'm going to touch on that because these things are all related, and most people don't put them together. So normally, I don't know why, people are starting to do it now, but with sacred geometry we tend to stick to just the geometry. Emoto's work is more about intention, right, which is also a very interesting area, and that's vibrational, I'm going to argue. This stuff, cymatics, is yet another, you could call it discipline, and sacred geometry is yet another discipline. But if you start looking at all three together, it gets very, very interesting, and that's why I've chucked this in there. But at this stage, I just want to see, I want people to notice the form and the patterns in nature. That's the fruit of life, and we're not going to investigate this in too much detail tonight because I am just doing an introduction. But again, you can see how that's come about. But what's important about this is that if we add the male energy to the female energy, we get a thing called Metatron's cube. Now, have you heard of it? You've certainly heard of this. You haven't heard of it?
No, I've seen it.
Okay. Now, this is very, very famous. It's also well known in esoteric circles. It's as old as we can possibly tell that the Earth's been here. That's how old all this stuff is. And it's very representative of the whole area of matter. And as it says up there, this shape called Metatron's cube, which is why it's so well known in sacred geometry, actually holds all the Platonic solids. Has anyone heard of the Platonic solids? Not even in passing? No? Oh, okay, I've got some interesting stuff to tell you.
That's a new one.
Plato, you've all heard of Plato the philosopher? Yeah, about 400 BC, Plato sort of formalised the Platonic solids, hence the name.
Is it Platonic? Like as in
Platonic, yeah. And just getting back to this shape, which is called Metatron's cube, and you'll find a lot of this symbology in the Jewish faith, in terms of a thing called the Tree of Life. Very, very deep stuff. Their whole faith is based on this, right? Which most people aren't aware of, right? But ensconced in this three-dimensional thing, it's a two-dimensional representation, but that's a three-dimensional shape, is all the Platonic solids. And the interesting thing about Platonic solids, and that's them there, or a picture of them, there's 5 of them, is that everything made of matter in this world is made up of those shapes. Right? And prove that. Everything. And here's the bottom line. And the principle I'm trying to get across for anyone that might be interested in looking at the world through this lens is that they represent every possible molecular connection and contain all possible geometric laws of the reality and the universe in which we live. Alright? Now, I expect people to see this straight up, but the important thing to take out of this, just as an introduction, is the foundation of all physical matter, and matter is the key word here. We're not talking about other dimensions of our existence, we're just talking about material existence. So your body is made up of this stuff. It is how matter came into being, is what I'm arguing, through this lens of sacred geometry. Not talking about other dimensions, which we would have to call spiritual or energetic or etheric or chakra systems, you know, all those other, what we usually refer to as energy bodies, higher dimensions. We're not talking about those, we're just talking about the matter. I'm wanting to make a very clear distinction between the physical universe and these other things. So,
Ian, before you go on,
yeah,
could you go back to the previous slide
yeah.
and tell me the number of sides to each of those 5 objects?
I've got some notes somewhere that I can give you later, but yeah, there's obviously a cube,
There's a cube and
6 sides, and you have yeah, it's up to 10 sides. 10 sides.
What, for the Metatron's cube? Is that what you're asking?
No, the platonic solids.
Oh.
Isn't it
Yeah.
4, 6, 8, 10, 12?
Yeah, it's something like that.
I think it is, yeah.
One starts with 4,
The pyramid's 4, the cube's 6.
and there was the triangle one's also got 4.
Yeah, just for
The
you.
dodecahedron's 8.
Let's see what's there.
That's got 6, hasn't it? 4, 6.
Alright, that's the characteristics for those that want to go into a little bit more geometry.
Oh, yes.
Alright. So they're the 4 things that are required, and that's what they're called: a cube, octahedron, tetrahedron, icosahedron, and dodecahedron, which is 10. So I'll give you those notes if you like it. Okay, I'll just go back to
It's interesting when it says if the solid is placed inside a sphere, all the points are touching the surface of that sphere, which is quite amazing.
it. Is when you really think about
Yeah.
this stuff, and that's what it requires, like contemplation of what's being said here.
Yeah.
And get your mind into it. It starts to get really very, very interesting.
Yeah.
You know. And
Yes.
that's, good observation.
Mm.
There. So we'll just go flick through again.
The etched,
You want to go back? I don't want to go back on this. I just
in the Egyptian temple where that was etched, is there any indication of size of that?
yeah, it's not very
Not
big. It's
real big,
probably
is it?
about this big. So
I'm guessing that's marble.
yeah, it's marble or granite pillars. Yeah, and these are just a couple of examples. So we could have a fight
Chase
about
that
when
one.
it was done, and you'll get numbers anywhere between 38,000 years ago and sort of 2,000 or 3,000 BC, depending on which mainstream archaeologists you want to listen to. But the point is that this stuff's been around for a very, very long time, and it's been kept a secret. So it's quite a strange thing to say, but if you really look at this stuff and you look at, we have the knowledge now to look at atoms and look at molecules and look at what's going on in the microcosm, and they already knew about all this very, very long time ago. And these are representations, this whole sacred geometry concept, representations of the fact that it's all related to how matter's constructed. Yeah, so that's fine. And these are just a couple of examples. It's absolutely everywhere. I could show you 1,000 slides all over the world where you see this stuff. Yeah, so there's the plutonic solids. They all come out of Metatron's cube. they are the basis of this set of all matter and all molecular connections, and that's not disputed by what I call mainstream scientific materialism. Just a couple of examples. That's a natural crystal, and it forms in a perfect square as it forms. It's called pyrite. Have you ever come across that stuff?
Studied geology, forgotten most of it.
Yeah, so that's just a natural, that's sacred geometry manifest in physical form. And there's another interesting one here, that's fluorite. There's tons of these, so that crystal grows, right? It just literally grows, right? It's quite amazing. And of course the obvious one, and this is all based on, you can break any of these up and they are the platonic solids, and that's a snowflake. And that's all built very beautiful. For some reason they're appealing to the eye, these things too, which is another interesting thing. Why do we find this stuff appealing to look at? And I think most people would. But that's all been constructed just naturally by the inherent forces in the universe, and that's all based on 5 platonic solids. That's how that's been constructed.
The platonic solids you're talking about, they're a base representation of matter, is that correct? In other words, when you've got those snowflakes or ice crystals or whatever, they sort of build up on each other.
They're the building blocks and all the molecular connections between anything in this universe that we've found, anything on the Earth, is made up of those 5 platonic solids.
That apply to the entire periodic table, because you might have 100 odd different elements, and they've all got different shapes. And
yeah, it's a slightly different domain. Because now you're talking about our representations of what a molecule looks like. That's and acids and amino acids and all that. But it's the same principle, with respect to sacred geometry.
The concept in electronics, which is standing waves, and a standing wave, what appears on an antenna, on an aerial, and that's how it picks it up. The frequency corresponds to the length of the antenna. And so that's electromagnetic energy. But from what I've seen, it also applies to matter itself. The standing waves apply to matter and molecules or atoms, let's say.
I argue that it's all the same thing.
It's all vibration, in other words.
So a standing wave or any electromagnetic wave is still a wave, and it's also a vibration, isn't it? It's just at a different frequency.
And anything solid, I've seen it described as frozen light. Anyway.
Anyway, this is divine proportion, and this is a little bit steering away from the fundamentals, basics of sacred geometry, but it's just something again to notice. Just very quickly, this is focusing on the phi ratio. Has anyone heard of the phi ratio?
Square root of 5 plus 1 on 2.
Yeah, 1.61 roughly. Right.
Now,
if you're not a mathematician, sitting there and if you sit and contemplate that, which scientists do, they start to go crazy. So it's an irrational number. It doesn't make any sense in mathematics. Yet there it is, right? And we'll explore
all buildings up till 1862 throughout the entire world, Eastern and Western, were built on the golden ratio, golden mean ratio.
Yeah, that's right.
It was only when the fucking architects in America said we can build anything we want, they started building skyscrapers. They weren't golden mean.
Yeah, it goes back a long way.
Yeah.
So the Giza Plateau is riddled with...
An ex-town planner in America researched it, wrote a book about it. Leonardo
da Vinci, so all his... Anyone's seen that picture, that very famous picture you see everywhere? It's all about the phi ratio. The Mona Lisa, is entirely constructed from the fire ratio. So just to give an example in the body, you can see the hand up in the right-hand corner there. What we're talking about here is if you look at the joint distance, just in your finger, this between here and here is 1.61 times the distance between here and the end of your finger, and between the ratio between this distance here, between those two knuckles, and this knuckle and that knuckle, is also 1.61. Right, and it goes right through your body. So, yeah.
The people's height is their nose.
Yeah,
And your feet are the distance.
that's it. And your face is structured on this ratio. So they've known about this for a very, very long time. And all the architecture, that's why you see the Pantheon there, that if you draw that shape there, it fits perfectly into that architecture, and that's what Paul's talking about.
And another really interesting thing, all Freemason buildings, temples, whatever they're called, Freemason lodges,
Yeah,
all built on Golden Mean.
that's it. And so the pyramids gets really, really interesting when you look into the pyramids and all the relationships there, including the phi ratio, the pi ratio, pi, which is 3.14, which supposedly wasn't discovered until, you know, a few years ago, or until Newton and all those guys started turning up. But they knew about all this stuff a very, very long time ago. And most people, when they go to Giza Plateau, just say, oh, look at those pyramids, and it's a bit of a touristy thing, but they don't really know what they're looking at, not really. Because encased in these buildings is sacred geometry and sacred knowledge, and that's what this is really about. And it's a great way to preserve it over time, I think, too. That's what those monuments are about, amongst a whole lot of other things. So I don't want to go too far into this, just to try and link them together though. So that's the phi ratio. If you look at galaxies, you'll often see that the way they spiral is also phi. It's just one example. So this is the macrocosm talking about now is another one. Here's something in the microcosm. That's a nautilus shell. I actually used that image in a marketing thing for a business. I just think it's very beautiful. Just that's how it speaks to me. I don't know if other people have that reaction to it, but that's pure. That's just a snail, you know. It's a snail shell, but you can see the beautiful geometry represented there. And this is more, you know, we're coming down into the microcosm here. We just had a look at the macrocosm. We just looked out into the expanse of space, and here we're seeing the same ratios down in the microcosm. We can go smaller and smaller with this stuff. We can go right down to microscopic level, and we see the same patterns, the same sacred geometry, and the same, in this case, phi ratio. Just thought I'd throw that one in, because that's very, very old. The yin and yang comes from Eastern philosophies. But again, it's the way that's constructed. And you can see it's sort of inherent on some funny level. Anyone see that? Just drawing a circle and putting this sort of rather phi-looking shape in it, and the ratios just sort of turn out to be phi as well. I've just thrown that in as just a side issue. But just what? What was your name?
Vicky.
Vicky raised. This is another. It's in the 90s. Have you guys heard about this guy?
Yeah.
So this is in the 90s, and what Dr. Amito did was he had glass jars with water in them. He used a number of versions of this experiment. And what he would do is walk past them every day and say to one, I love you, and say to another one, I hate you. Right? He used music and all sorts of strange things, harmonious music and harmonious thoughts, and these are the results he got. So, I think he did it for 30 days. Now what they did was actually froze the water. So what you're looking at is after, engaging in this activity for 30 days, they froze the water and then took cross sections of it. And you can see the thank you is quite geometric in shape. I will kill you looks pretty yucky, so that's actually the water. And there's a nice crystal, there's some Japanese prayer work examples there as well. Oh yeah, Mozart Symphony. So this is very real, and it was peer reviewed, as we say, so this was replicated by other scientists in their own same experiment. And really where we're getting to here is, because this is a human intention, right? This is not something we've generated with cymatics, with a sound generator. This is something that can come out of us in terms of our intention and the effect that it has on the external world, but also really importantly what it has, the effect it has in your inner world, physical world. Right? I'm going to get to that next because this is really powerful. So I'm going to make, these are my statements I'm making here, not anyone else's. So intention manifests in the material world. I'm going to make that statement that is a fact. And it goes right back to that very first slide about what it was that created something out of the void, and that's consciousness. Consciousness created this whole thing where we're literally living in a dream. Has anyone heard that expression?
Living in a matrix.
It's a matrix, but the matrix come from this sort of information. That's where they got it from, and mixed it with the Bible. Intention affects physical matter, so I'm making a reference to our own personal intention when I say that. And intention is vibration, and it is frequency. So they're just three statements that I'm making. I'm not saying they're fact. Decide that for yourself. Alright, this image here is water with a certain frequency being transmitted through it. And again, we start to see these rather sacred geometric shapes appearing. What's really interesting about this, and I'm jumping a little bit outside sacred geometry, is that water has a memory. Has anyone heard that? This has been proven scientifically, that water has a memory. Now you can watch this video online if you want to, prove it to yourself. And what they did was ramp up this frequency, time how long it was before that pattern appeared. And the first time it took 6 seconds, and then they turned it off. It's in a little water petri dish, so waited for the water to go smooth. Turn on the frequency again, and the second time it only took, I think it took 5 seconds for that pattern to appear. And then they did it again, and then it only took 3 seconds, which I think it says on the slide there. Now that's just one way of trying to prove this fact that is known, that water has a memory. Right? So what's your body made of?
90% water.
93% water.
Yeah. There's varying figures on this, but some people say it's 80%. The brain is 83% water.
Yeah.
So if water has a memory and you're predominantly water, what's happening if someone's emitting bad intentions towards you?
Yeah.
Or more importantly, if someone's if you're emitting hatred or some, wounded type energy towards another human being, then guess who it's affecting? Yourself.
Fascinating.
Right? And this is why this stuff's so interesting. And in my world, this relates to sacred geometry as well, but we're sort of heading into the energy aspect of what this existence is all about. So I've got another couple of really interesting slides here. That's cancer. I don't like putting horrible pictures on them. That's actually a real picture of someone's brain. And within the context of where I got these images from, they're talking about using vibration as a means to, one, heal, but two, identify where the cancer stops and the healthy tissue begins. And that's not really what this is about. That's just where I got the image. But I'll put that up because that's the results I'm arguing that these are the sort of things that happen when we have crap or bad or disharmonious intentions directed at us, or we're carrying them within ourselves, we're affecting our own water, it has memory, and eventually it starts to affect the cells, which are all made up of sacred geometry, by the way. So I'm just throwing this out there. I'm totally convinced of this personally, but I just want to get away from that horrible picture a little bit more and just show you some other images. So the one on the left is the cymatic image. This is produced just by putting frequency through the medium of water. And the one on the right is an actual fossilised critter that we find in creation. And in this case, that's a 65 million year old fossil on the right. And this is something that was produced just by emitting some frequencies into water. We all know that there is an argument that things started to grow in the primordial soup, isn't it, in water, where the first cells, which may be right, started to all come together. But it's a bit of a digression. This is a really interesting one. So again, the one on the left is produced purely by putting frequency into a petri dish of water. The one on the right is an actual fossilised critter from 526 million years ago. Now they're not exactly the same, but remember this field here, they're being very careful with it because it's quite confronting to the current paradigm, scientific materialist paradigm. But so they're not identical, but we can start to infer that there is something in all this, that vibration and memory and how things actually come into existence.
Do you think that they purposely were emanating the frequency of the critter to create that in the petri dish? That they identified the frequency of that?
They have been playing. Yeah, they have been playing with this, but my understanding of it so far with the cymatics is that they're just mucking around and seeing
lots of different frequencies.
Seeing what happens.
Yeah,
Yeah.
photographing.
Because I haven't got a video, and I could have brought one, but you guys can look at yourself. If you want to actually look at a video, just Google it. It's amazing what's coming out now. It's just incredible. You can actually watch as the frequency goes up or down. You can see these horrible discordant shapes appear in the sand, and then you get to certain frequencies, and then everything just turns into this beautiful harmonious pattern. And then the frequency keeps going up, and it all sort of reshuffles itself, and there's no form or sort of balance, and then another thing forms, right? Now, I just want to tell you that the military guys have known about this for a very long time, and they have weapons based on this, right? They've been developing for a really long time.
That's what 5G is.
So 5G, that's connected to this, yes, in terms of its potential.
Its potential.
Right.
Well, its potential is it actually exceeds that of the weapons that the military have that they use.
Yeah, it's about power, how much power they put into it as well. But I wasn't going to talk about that, but that's definitely, I knew you guys make some connections there, right? Because that's millimetre wave technology, which is about similar to microwave. It's about the same frequency, a bit higher. They've got a range there as microwaves. So if you turn the power up on that, it's going to do some damage, yeah. So the argument would be, I think at this stage, how much power is actually going to come through the repeaters that are out there every 200
Well,
metres.
we've got the ground ones, but we've also got the ones that are going to put up into
It's in satellites.
They're not there yet.
Yeah, well, it's 40,000 planned by 40,000 satellites. They're trying to get approval for now. Elon Musk is one of them. I think his application's 36,000, and there's another couple of other groups that are wanting to put them up as well. So that's just.
Well, Gates just wants to cover the Earth, so we don't see the sun. So open.
Yeah, well, it gets very esoteric if you look at this stuff closely. Very, very esoteric anyway. It's all good. We don't need to worry about it too much, but that's another story. Anyway, that's just another fossil, cymatic pattern on the left, and the real thing on the right. And that's pretty much it. So this was just an introduction tonight. I want to just see how people respond to this stuff, because we can go into it a lot. This man's got some wants to go deeper.
Oh, yeah.
We can go into this stuff a lot deeper, but we'll just pull three quite separate things. But can you see there could be a relationship between
Yeah.
cymatics,
Yes.
intention, and sacred geometry? And how important it is that we keep our water, keep our water in good nick. You know, and stress is
Yes.
another one. So we've all got to deal with stress, don't we?
Yes.
But you know, if water has a memory,
That's
Which
good to
does.
know. If more people knew that, I think it might help them take good care of themselves a bit more, put a bit more time into looking after themselves
yeah.
and doing that sort of looking after yourself.
Well, getting
You
into
know.
just that maybe yoga, breathing, and
Yes.
just centering and not carrying this stuff around. I mean, watching your own thoughts, which is
Yes.
we can't always help this, can we? Sometimes we just are really pissed off.
Yes.
and,
Yes.
and really hurt. And sometimes you want, if you're going through something horrific, like
Yes.
a relationship breakdown, or you know, I just want to bring it back to this world now, or someone stalking you, or whatever,
Or children abandoning you.
or betrayal, deep
Betrayal.
betrayal, whatever. You can carry a little bit of. That's why I don't.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what happens to me. I won't harbour those thoughts. And if they do come, I'm just very able to get rid of them pretty quickly.
Yes.
But they do come. But I think we all have them.
Human,
Yeah.
and those they are going to
Yeah.
come,
Yeah.
and we can't pretend that they're not there,
Yeah.
but holding on to them is where the damage is
Yeah.
done. We're trying to pretend that
What you resist persists.
Yeah, exactly right.
And so
That's a- well,
it's
that's a
matter of
t-shirt.
allowing.
So we have to try and
Like that.
accept whatever it is that's making us angry and full of hate. Otherwise, we're only hurting ourselves, and that's really what forgiveness is. You don't forgive people for their sake.
Yes.
You
Yeah,
forgive
it's for
them
yourself,
for your
that's
sake.
right. Yeah.
That's the bottom line. Because if you don't, you're
Yeah.
only hurting yourself.
I like to think that you're forgiving them for both your sakes.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, I
the
think
concept
that's- I
is
think
they're not
that's true.
separate from the other anyway.
Then there's
Yeah.
that we all one and
Yeah,
we're
that's
all
what we've
one,
got to wake up
which is
to.
all this stuff that's linking that it's all the
Yeah.
oneness,
Yeah.
which is quite cool.
Yeah, so just an interesting one. The water that runs over the rocks, say up at the spring, I know you drink a bit of spring water. It's if anyone's seen information on structured water, so it gets refreshed when it's just in nature and coming over rocks and being all mixed up. But the water coming through pipes from our reservoirs, I'm not talking about fluoride or anything like that, but that water's flowing through God knows what energy, vibration, in a sort of a dead environment. And by the
Yes.
time it comes out of the tap, it's not. And it picks up the memory of its travel.
Yeah, that's
You know
true,
what I mean?
particularly.
So
But
if you're...
sadly, they're
Yeah.
replacing all the cast iron water pipes with polypropylene
Mm.
and black 6-inch.
But just say that water's going through under the ground and, God knows, all the way
Yeah,
through.
well, I tried to find...
What's it picking up? What information is it
Yeah.
picking up?
It's the best
Yeah.
filter. You don't know whether that water comes out of Mongol. It's been in there 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. You know where it's coming from.
It's also full of vibration is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I've only skimmed across the top tonight, but we
Yeah,
can talk
that's
just
great.
on that subject. You can show how water picks up dirty energy from vibration based on what it passes through. And we're not even talking about it not being clean, because it might have fluoride in it, so there's no bacteria.
No.
Right?
So
Can't
it's
have
being
fluoride.
restricted and tightened
But
in and
its
forced.
inner structure
Yeah,
is carrying information.
yes.
And there's even a lot of scientific stuff being done in relation to memory actually being retained to a large degree in our bodies through water that's in our bodies.
They've been doing a lot of studies genetically on, a lot of philosophers were sort of thought about it anyway, but cultural memory passed through the genes as well.
Yeah.
It's actually experience. So trauma through the genetics can actually be passed on. So the
Absolutely.
trauma of your parents through the DNA, actually there's a resonance in your DNA as well
That's it.
from that. And there's all the other cultural aspects as well,
Yeah.
when you see like a little African kid this big and they're already just, oh sorry, doing such incredible tribal dancing at such a young age, and the legacy of where supposedly we were born from Africa, you know, the Homo sapiens anyway. There's that whole, that memory, cultural memory stays through very strongly, you know, through the DNA. That's quite interesting as well, I find.
Yeah, well, intergenerational transfer of trauma
Yeah.
is, one of my mates is a female friend, is a PhD.
Oh
in the
wow.
Order of Australia.
Wow.
That's her specialty, right?
Oh wow.
But they still haven't figured it out.
Yes. Yes.
But we know it happens.
They know that. Yeah.
Right, but they've got a very
they're onto it.
materialist. Well, they have a very materialist view. We call it scientific materialism. That's what I call it. And someone else has coined that term.
Yes.
But we know that that information translates through animals and people. What you're talking about, it's inherited information, right?
Yes.
And trauma is an interesting aspect of that, because there's no question that's real,
Yeah.
in my mind anyway.
Yes.
But with people that deal with the human mind and trying to understand these things just in the physical domain, they will tend to be materialists. They don't have any personal experience of things that are beyond the material. I don't know anyone in this room has, but I certainly have. It's just been a big part of my life, where I experience things that are not possible, you know, in the physical realm. They don't seem to have had those experiences. It's just something I've noticed. So they're still struggling with it,
Yes.
of how that information actually is communicated. But I argue a lot of it is actually vibrational as well.
Yes.
Right, so there is that thing in the DNA which is vibrating. By the way, if you get into matter, it's actually pulsing in and out of existence.
Yeah.
And we can address that with sacred geometry. But there's also this vibrational aspect. So with your parents, so we grow up around them. There's what they tell us, there's what they do to us, right?
Yes.
But there's mostly it's what they vibrate
What we emanate.
towards us that we soak up.
Yes.
It's not verbal, it's not even physical.
Yeah. It's
And
their
we
own
learn so much through
experience that
that.
emanates
Yeah, and we're not aware
towards
of
you.
that.
Yeah.
So that's another vibrational form of
Yes.
communicated information that goes through
Which is
generations.
an interesting one with respect
Yeah.
to the tendency for children, young children, babies especially, to
Yeah.
first thing they look at is your eye.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they would remain that way, but what they find is that they don't get coming back.
Yeah. Right.
And so they get used to not getting that full connection.
Mm.
It's really interesting with
interesting.
children like that.
Well, I argue they're still connected. Kids are still connected to their
Absolutely.
ether.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not instantaneous, but it's over a period of time where they
Diminish.
lose that connection, or
Yeah.
it's talked out of
Or
them.
it gets bashed out.
Drummed out of us.
And then we're
Skilled
just-
out of us.
Yeah, it's schooled out of us, and then
Absolutely.
and look at what's going on now. Like Newton, Darwin. No one ever reads his book, but he stated very clearly that he's not arguing that evolution is the only, just pure chance. He states it in his book. But what we're taught in schools is they still leave all that etheric, inherent form
aspect
stuff
of it.
out
Yes, out of it.
and argue it's pure chance. And what that does
Yes.
is then take away this whole dimension from people's
Yes.
thinking.
Yes.
Right? That there might be a more creative,
Yeah.
because we are all
Possibility.
creatives, So there, and then even in, that's not just me, Einstein said it, right? It's in plain English, that without mind, there is no matter. He was acknowledging that there is this greater mind at work that we all exist in. It's in his book. So E equals MC squared, which most people don't really understand anyway,
Yeah.
and is questionable, right? It's not just this physical, it's energy equals matter
Yes.
times the square of the speed of light. That's the formula.
Yeah.
And his general theory of relativity and all that other physics stuff, it's okay, it works to a degree, but it's not full. It misses out on a lot of things. And he doesn't even define matter properly. right? Now, I don't know whether he was into sacred geometry, but I'm pretty sure he would have known about it, because they all do. Newton did.
Yes.
And they all studied this stuff in Egypt before they wrote their books in the Western world. So there's this whole culture of all these guys that are quite famous that we all know about, all went and studied the ancient arts, often in Egypt, and then later in life they produced their works that they're famous for in the Western world. So it's not even their information, you know, they've got it from the ancients. That's where they got it from. And the really good stuff, which I could talk about, most of us, you actually have to take people there in a funny sort of energetic way and give them an experience of this, which you can do with people's permission. But some things you'll never show people because it's too dangerous.
Yes.
Right? It's about what you can actually do with consciousness
Yes.
and matter. So that's what all this is about.
Wow.
But I find it really fascinating
Yes.
to be aware of the impact we have on our own
It's
bodies, but
Yes.
more importantly, of manifesting. I don't know what your guys' experiences are there, holding
Absolutely.
intention and
Makes
watching
total
things
sense.
come together.
Yes.
And the forces that try and take it away from you, in terms of the attention that you're holding. Yeah, you can put this in the context of what we were talking about before.
Yes.
The energy it takes to have to constantly, you know,
Yes.
make sure you can keep.
Yes.
There's an item, oh sorry, I'll let you finish first.
Yeah, go on.
There's an item which might be relevant to all this, and that's the idea of resonance,
Yes. It's
and
yeah.
an experiment that we ran many years ago in this room, just to show that the resonance works, is two guitars on either side of the room, and if they're in tune and you pluck one of the guitars on one side of the room, the other one also resonates and produces the same vibration. However, if they're out of tune, then it doesn't matter how hard you pluck that string on this side of the room, the other side of the room doesn't vibrate at all, right? And so in matter terms, you have to have resonance in order to have a particular shape, you know, even atoms, from the hydrogen atom up to the unstable radioactive ones, are a conglomeration of elements which form the atom according to the standing waves, which we mentioned before. You know, they're resonating in such a way that they form this stable structure. You know, some of them are more stable than others, and some of them, what do they call it? They leak.
Yeah.
They decay. Yeah. And an interesting analogy is when you tune in a radio station on a radio, all the radio stations exist, right? They all exist, but you're using tuning to tune in on one station only, right? And even though you can only hear that one station, all the other ones exist, right? But then you can take that analogy a little bit further, because I came across over the years and over the decades that there are other realities that exist in this very space, right? There's multiple realities all at once in the same space, and they've got no idea of the other, right? Right, so there might be other beings in here, in this room, we don't even know about. Or the room might be a completely different dimension. Sorry?
I think we can guarantee it.
You can guarantee it, yeah.
Well, you can also pick them up as well.
Well, the conclusion I made from that was you don't the way we tune in electromagnetic energy on a radio also applies to matter.
Yeah.
You can tune into the vibration of this reality. And if you tune out of this reality, this dimension disappears and you come into another one.
Yeah,
Right?
well, that's getting into, the holographic.
Sorry?
Holographic elements too. But if you go far enough with that, which I think is what you're alluding to, reality becomes questionable itself. And it's very easy to prove that reality is a perception.
Yeah, it is perception.
Very easy to prove that.
You're only tuned to one
Lots of
frequency.
people in this dimension that are having completely different experiences. I've got a guy that takes photos of stuff all the time.
Mm.
That's
Right.
externally, because, as above, so below,
Mm.
as within, so without,
Mm.
what's been created. But he manifests stuff that I can't see. It isn't there. He
Mm.
takes a photo of it, and it is there in the photo. Does it all the time.
Wow.
So
Mm.
that stuff's real. I don't live in that world every day. I just know it exists because it
Yes.
happens. And if I want to go and explore that, I can. I'm too busy creating my own.
Yeah, exactly. Discovering
And
your
a
own
few
sort of
problems.
thoughts.
Hey?
Yes.
Yeah, because the damaged parts of you vibrate and create as well. So
Well, you have to
yeah,
stay in this
Yeah.
reality in order to
Yeah.
function in it, because if you start going off, you might get lost.
Well, it's just being aware that any heavy, or sometimes call it heavy vibration, like anger or hatred, or all those
Mm.
emotions, do actually manifest,
Yeah.
and they attract
Yeah.
experiences into your world. So that's why another good reason to get rid of them. And you can be not aware that they're there too.
Yes.
That's the scary part. So like childhood trauma, it kind of relates to what I was.
Yes. And
Same
then there's
last
also
week.
how do you then
Yeah.
stop the patterns happening through neurochemical patterns and hardwiring
Yeah.
as well. And so as adults and as individuals, as we grow older, we don't want to blame our parents for what happened to us, because they'll probably
Are we?
going through their own their own shit. And
Yeah.
sure, you might be a bit like, that was shit. But as you, in terms of your own experience, like sure, you're holding it,
Yeah.
you can release it, and you can then change the way your neurochemistry thinks. It's possible to change it, and understanding. I've done some research on ego structure as well, and if you can understand more about human behaviour, the crux of it, and your own ecosystem and patterns, then you can observe those voices telling you to do things, which are quite often done from ego structure in terms of survival and how am I going to survive in this world. And if you don't let them become very solid, you have lots of other options as you get older. So you can hope possible to reprogram your own neurochemistry, but it takes a lot of work, and also as well, if you're in a competitive environment, you fall back on your habits to survive,
Absolutely.
and that can become a very hard shell as you get older.
Yeah, that's the sort of psychological paradigm, which is
Yes.
perfect.
Yes,
Because it's exactly right. So,
yeah, it's just a different
and I
paradigm.
think you can express that. You can move up levels into the energy aspects of, and that's where we
Yes.
get this idea of energy healing from, isn't it too?
Yes,
Or travelling back in time to that point where the injury occurred. Let's
Yes.
say it was an abuse issue in a child.
Yes.
And recreating that experience.
Recreate it.
It becomes just something that you would have liked to happen. That's what NLP is.
yes,
It's
they
all
do that with
those
some of the
models
schema,
are drawn
don't
off other deeper metaphysical concepts.
they? Yes,
And you can get rid of that. You can. But you have to
Yeah.
want to let it go too. Because
yes.
sometimes we hang on to this
We
stuff.
get addicted to it, don't you? And then it gives
Because
you a
it's
bit of
familiar.
power.
It's who we know ourselves to be.
Yes,
Want to get rid
It's
of
very
it?
hard to get rid of, yeah.